But first, if you want to believe the politicians' spin, things are well and truly on their way back to normal in Australia. But you only have to look at shut state borders, heavy restrictions, businesses and jobs that will never return to know we're a long way back from being back on our feet. Today, for so many, the reality of Flemington hit home. For the first time in 159 years, the horses were on the track, but the grandstands were empty, and that thunderous roar when they round the turn and head for home, well, it fell silent. It's only been 12 months, but last year's race seemed like a world away. It might be the race that stops the nation, but it's a pandemic that stopped all of us as well. And the queen of the track, well, she wasn't amused.
Quite ridiculous, really, the way they've gone on in Victoria with the Premier there. He should wake up and let people get on with their business. And, by all means, social distance and things like that. But look, you can't have the country cut off at the knees.
And of course, Gay's right. Over $450 million of economic impact out of the Spring Carnival has been lost to Victoria. The hotel rooms, the milliners, the retailers, the restaurants, the cabs to and from the airport. And look at this today. Here was Randwick in Sydney for their Melbourne Cup meeting. Everyone was everywhere and nothing in Victoria. It's all on the back of an empty MCG for the grand final that was in Queensland. I tell you, you got a feel for Victorians who've lost so much this year through no fault of their own, instead the sheer incompetence of their government causing all this pain. And while the rest of the country gets to enjoy Victoria's big events, well, Victorians are still bearing the brunt of the state's hotel quarantine failures, the devastating second wave that resulted out of all of those mistakes, and a contact tracing system that's still nowhere as good as it needs to be to keep the state open. I'll get to the Cup a little later on in the show and a whole lot more, but there's a few more revelations tonight that add to the pressure already on the Coate Inquiry to urgently reopen hearings if Jennifer Coate is to find the truth and do her job as she promised in the chair.
I expect no less than full, frank and timely cooperation.
Now, on top of my weekend special report featuring security subcontractors who wanted to testify, who wanted to provide evidence and did, but were still never called, today in the Australian newspaper I report that the Victorian Government Purchasing Board's deep concerns about the lack of probity in job department procurement processes and complaints that the board were not permitted to give evidence to Coate. Now, this board is supposed to be Victoria's independent watchdog on how ministers and officials spend your money. It's supposed to guard against jobs for the mates and money in brown paper bags, as we sensationally saw last week in the anti-corruption hearings. But given it hasn't been called by Jennifer Coate, it's become harder for this watchdog to play its role effectively. Frankly, it's a scandal that so much was known or should have been known to the inquiry, yet has not been properly followed up. And yes, there's all the evidence now apparent that people from the Premier down haven't been called or haven't given accurate or candid information about who made the fateful decision to put safety of Victorians in the hands of private security guards rather than the police and the military. We haven't got all the answers. And there's more and more grave suspicions about giving the bulk of private security work to a particular business, Unified Security, that wasn't on the list of approved providers and whose principals' previous businesses had gone into administration owing millions. Now, remember this warning that went out 3 days before the Unified deal was struck from the Purchasing Board to all Victorian government agencies. And it said, and I quote, "In unusual times like this, it's important to acknowledge an increased risk of unscrupulous and ill-prepared suppliers offering to supply to the Victorian government. Please be vigilant," it said, about the use of suppliers, in particular new suppliers. Now, despite this very, very clear warning, Martin Pakula's Jobs Department did a $30 million deal in 6 hours flat on the back of a couple of emails and text messages. And it's a deal that the department's own procurement people thought, pretty much straight away, raised red flags. A couple of days after the unified deal happens on the weekend, a very worried public servant wants to know how on earth this mob could get this sort of contract seemingly outside the rules. And he wrote in an email, "I understand," said the official, "that there was an urgency to get things up and running over the weekend. But to have a non-approved firm providing security and effectively enforcing government regulation at quarantine sites off the back of some emails and phone calls," he says, "represents significant risk that's not easily mitigated." Well, tonight, it gets a whole lot worse, with yet another email surfacing, buried deep in a pile of documents submitted to Coate, that suggests that the unified contract itself may not have been properly executed. Here's this email from an official unhappy with what he was required to do. Charles Rankin is his name. He's a director in Simon Femister's private office. Now, Femister, of course, is the Secretary of Victoria's Jobs Department. Rankin's email reads, "I've put Simon Femister, that's the departmental head's signature on the contract with Unified Security. But this is the last one we should do like this, because I'm not comfortable," he said, "putting his signature on it and then signing as a witness that he signed in my presence, without at least a verbal confirmation that he, Femister, wants to sign the contract." Now, I kid you not. All credit to Michael Smith, who found that email in all of those papers before Coate. Now, is it any wonder, as I wrote on the front page of the Australian newspaper today, that the Purchasing Board spent much of September making its probity concerns known to the Victorian Treasury, including their minister, and complaining that none of this had been properly told to the Coate Inquiry. Here's what some of those letters and emails said. The Purchasing Board, quote, said it had not been approached to provide relevant evidence or a witness statement to the Coate Inquiry, even though this was standard practice with government inquiries. The board said the Treasury's statement that was provided to the inquiry had overlooked the key fact, and I quote, of the failure of the Jobs Department's procurement accreditation process. The board reminded Treasury, and again I quote, that public servants had an obligation to disclose and be model witnesses, and that, quote, the lack of accreditation of the Jobs Department is a materially relevant fact that may or may not be of interest to the inquiry. Then there's the sheer inadequacy of the Coate Inquiry's examination of witnesses to date. When the Jobs Department head Simon Femister mentioned a call from the Premier's private office about private security, there was no follow-up questioning from counsel assisting. There was no forensic questioning about how an exemption from normal contracting processes for this unified contract was obtained. There was no reference to the internal Jobs Department emails raising concerns over the integrity of the deal with Unified. The obvious question to Femister, on whose authority was this $30 million deal with Unified done? Well, that question to Femister was never asked. I mean, today, this latest email has got to be the last straw, doesn't it? A $30 million contract that's got every appearance of being improperly signed by Victorian government officials. And yet not a question was asked about this email admission by counsel assisting, even though they had in their paperwork this very email. Now, I'm not saying that the Coate Inquiry has been incompetent. I'm not saying that the Coate Inquiry has lacked integrity. But I am saying that it has not given me any hope so far that they will find out the truth. Now, to do that, the Coate Inquiry can only proceed one way from here. It must reopen hearings, and it must examine witnesses under oath if it wants to do its duty to the Victorian people. Anything other than reopening the inquiry and calling witnesses under oath will be a travesty.